Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. People are working longer these days. After a long decline in retirement ages, a new trend emerged a couple decades ago, and now people are working more. Are they doing so because they want to, or because they have to? And what impact does their educational level have on their ability to find or keep work into their 60s or 70s? That's what we're here to talk about today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. The topic today, working longer, and the impact of education on that decision. There's been a major shift in the country as more people are working later into their 60s. There are many reasons for the shift, but one interesting factor is the impact of education on the ability for older Americans to get or keep work. We're joined today by Ariane Hegewisch, the Program Director for Employment and Earnings at the Institute for Women's Political Research, which studies how education pays off for older Americans. The Institute also studies the wage gap between men and women and a host of other factors that can have an impact on the state of finances for older Americans. So Ariane, thank you very much for joining us today. So we're here to talk about the decision to work longer, what drives it, what impact it has on the labor market, and specifically what impact education has on it. We'll be talking about a couple of different reports from your organization, primarily how education pays off for older Americans, and looking back, looking ahead, a chart book on women's progress. So we'll get to the education in a second. I just want to give you a chance to give us a brief overview of what the Institute for Women's Policy Research does. You know, what kind of research do you do? What kind of studies do you do?
Well, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about our work. The Institute for Women's Policy Research is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 30 years, and we do social science research, rigorous research, but with the goal of influencing public policy to ensure that it includes the gender perspective. And really our goal is to have policies that improve the social and economic security of women and their families.
Okay, and how long have you been around?
For 30 years.
30 years,
yeah.
Okay. So we're going to talk about some of those topics, the economic topics, in a bit. But for now, let's focus on education and the impact it has on older workers. So for starters, tell me a little bit, why is this an issue now? You've studied the impact that level of education has on wages of older workers. What's driving that discussion right now?
Well, why are people working longer and why are we talking about it? Firstly, people are healthier. They're better off. They're living longer. And so for economies, that means if somebody retires age 65 or age 67 even, you may still, as a society, have to support them for 20 years. So it's very expensive, or 30 years. So economists are thinking about encouraging people to work longer. The second issue is people are healthier. They have longer life expectancy, so they can work longer. They may want to work longer. And of course, there's the issue that they may not have enough pension income or retirement savings. So that adds a kind of, a pull factor that keeps them in the labor market, doesn't give them much choice in terms of stopping.
Okay, so it's a combination of need and desire.
Need and desire, and for the economy that works for the individuals, but also because the society overall is aging, and the generation after the baby boomers had many fewer children than their families, and they have siblings, so there are fewer people coming up, and we need to keep people in the labor force to some extent to keep the economy going.
Okay, so your study, How Education Pays Off for Older Americans, looked at that issue, at the education issue, using American Community Survey data from the U.S. Census Bureau. What specifically were you looking at, and how is it actually measured with the American Community Survey?
So firstly, whatever we do, we always look at gender differences because we know that those really matter, particularly when you look at issues such as whether people work or not, where they work, and how much they earn. At that time, our data is from the American Community Survey, so it's official government data. And we looked at earnings, occupations, and whether people worked or not, whether they worked full-time or part-time. And really, we were interested in the value of education, both from the individual and from a societal perspective. Should we invest in education? Does it matter whether you have a university level degree or not? And how does it matter? And does it matter differently for women and men?
Okay. And big picture, what did you find? What were some of your results?
Well, it certainly matters for staying in the labor market and for how much you can earn. So, and the labor market, in a way, or the type of jobs that are available, value education more and more. It's very hard to get a good job if you don't have at least something beyond high school. For the current group of retirees, the people who are now in their 70s and 80s, a lot of them still, the number of people still don't have a university degree. Even now, it's only 30% of people in the workforce who have finished university education. But as you can see in this graph, the more education you have, the more likely you are going to be in the workforce. I think what's also really interesting from this graph is that, the peak is in your early 50s, and there's a decline in labor force participation way before what, Medicaid retirement or Medicare retirement at 65 or so. But also you can see that some people just keep on going, until you can't measure it anymore because there's so few people left in the age group that It doesn't make statistical sense anymore.
Okay, so we have the chart up here for women's, and then here's the chart for men. Same general trend, but the men's workforce participation rates are higher, but the same general trend is in evidence.
Exactly.
Okay, so why? It's a pretty big picture question here, but why is that? Some people are working into their 70s and 80s and beyond. We've talked a little bit about why that is, but what are the implications of it? I mean, if we have some people in the population working into their 70s and 80s and others aren't, what's that mean for society in general?
So firstly, if you think about education, if you have a university degree, if you have high level of education, you're also likely to have a desk job, less physically strenuous. You may have more resources to, get health services. So you're likely to be healthier and you're likely to be able to work longer. At one level, you probably have better retirement savings and don't have to work as long. But on the other hand, if you do, you earn more, so the incentives are greater. And what this suggests is for women and men, if you have high levels of education, you earn more and you work more, right? So it's opportunity probably, but also health. If you work in construction, it's highly unlikely that you're still going to be able to do that work when you're in your 70s. So there's a link between what kind of work you have done, what education you have, and whether you can still do that type of work when you're older. The other issue is if you work in a low-wage job, which often is more strenuous, you're less likely to have been able to build up pension savings. So that means that you may have to keep on going.
Okay. Now you have one chart in your education report that shows total earnings for somebody working between the ages of 65 and 95. And it's kind of projecting out how much additional income they might earn during that time. Now this shows a major gap between men and women and a major gap between those with high school education, some college, a bachelor's degree, and postgraduate education. Is this another big picture question here? Is this because those with the higher education levels are choosing to work longer, or is this because they're paid higher wages?
So that there's a bit of both in there. What we did is it's a kind of artificial construct. We took the average earnings for each level of education of those people who were still working at that age, right? And then summed it all up, making an artificial person, say an artificial man with a professional degree who works until he is 95. That we base this on the generation that was between 65 and 95 at the between 2005 and 2010, because those were the data that were available. And so what you can see there is, firstly, if you have qualification, it makes a huge difference to earnings, to actual earnings. It's probably also because of it's the earnings you can get and the incentives. So for men, it's 4 times as high between just having high school or less, or 5 times as high and having a professional degree like being a judge or a dentist or one of those occupations. For women, there's also a huge gain. But what was also very clear from that graph is that if you compare between women and men, whatever level of qualification, men make vastly more than women.
Okay. So your report focused on the people's level of education, but there's been a real discussion in recent years about lifelong learning, on the need to possibly retrain or go back to school for additional certifications or additional degrees. So what does, for those who are engaged in this lifelong learning, what's your advice to them about what kind of additional training or education could pay off for them?
It really matters what type of education you get, what field you qualify in, and that's specifically so for women or for women and men who work in fields which are mainly done by women. So the first thing is to get education. To go to university or get a community associate degree typically pays off. It's better than not having anything. But if you are, in your 50s or so and you're thinking about getting additional education, there are now very good programs. The AARP has done something together with the Community College Association, which are more focused and shorter than just going back and starting from scratch. What is important is the field in which you get it. There's a huge difference in returns to education. Whether you are you get, for example, if you are a librarian, you have to have a master's degree typically, and the average pay for librarians is lower than the average pay for computer support service specialists who typically don't even have a bachelor's degree. So it really matters what you get and where you get it. Okay.
And so are there certain, so you mentioned librarians, you mentioned computer support specialists. Are there fields that you could point to that are particularly good for mid-career people trying to get some additional education that could pay off for them?
It's not really, I don't think there are fields, mid-career fields, that the issue of digital media, business skills, all those work, whether you're young or middle-aged or older. The question is what kind of certificate you get, and also, the problem is if you are in your 50s, right? Like I am. I've worked with computers all my life, but younger people who make hiring decisions may think, what do they know about social media, right? Specifically if you're even older. So you may get the certificate to prove that you can do it, and it helps specifically if you already have people that give you the credit for it. So, the certificate may not overcome all kind of barriers that you may face in terms of perceptions of what older people can or cannot do.
So you're touching on the issue of discrimination there. So for older workers who need to change jobs or change careers, is it possible for them to do so? Or how can they, you mentioned getting additional certifications to prove to employers that their skills are up to date. Do you guys do research, or what does the research show about how much discrimination will prevent or hinder people who are in their 50s and 60s from actually getting work if they've developed these additional educational skills?
So we haven't done research on the outcome of getting additional, of completing additional certification at older ages. We know that for everybody, and a lot of people now at community colleges or universities on what they call non-traditional students, which is students who are 25 and older, right? So kind of adults in their working life. And the big issue is it costs to get education, particularly at university, and a lot of people don't complete because there are no good pathways, and because you typically also have to work to pay for the education. So really getting a few courses here and there doesn't really do a lot. The second issue is they are really good initiatives. It's best practice, which suggests that it's more exceptional than the norm, but there are competitions for employers to show that they take this issue of using older workers seriously, and they do issues around reskilling or apprenticeships. There are apprenticeships that are open to older workers, and certainly some older workers are going for those. There are issues on internships targeted at older people. So the problem is there clearly is discrimination. And also, if you lose your job, it's often very difficult to find a job of the same caliber again. And certifications help, but they have to be the right ones. And, you have to have an environment where people listen to you and see you, if you like.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about some of the kind of work that people are doing at advanced ages. I mean, these data come from the Looking Back, Looking Ahead chart book on women's progress that you do. First of all, tell me a little bit about that particular report. I can kind of sense what the focus is, but what sorts of things are you looking for in that?
Well, that report we did jointly, or the AARP funded us to do that report, and it was really to take in the early 60s, a number of important civil rights laws were passed. So the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Pay Act. And so they took this as saying, okay, 50 years later, where are we? Where are women at? And in that report, we looked at a range of indicators from marriage and children to the wage gap, to occupation, to women in management, to pension income, you kind of name it. And we looked at it and trying to look at intergenerational change, really.
Okay, and so we have a chart of the 10 largest occupations for women in mid-age 50 and older, and then we also have charts for most common occupations for women 65 to 69, and the same for men. So if we could look at the chart for the 10 largest occupations for men and women aged 50 and older. That chart shows that they show, the kinds of jobs that the women have and the kinds of jobs that men have. It shows the number of those jobs for those folks 50 and older around the country, and it also shows their average wage. So most of the jobs that are dominant on the female side or on the male side are generally lower wage jobs, but there are some that are higher wage jobs. They're not the top of the list, but they're in there. In general, from this, what can we learn looking at this? What kinds of jobs in general are folks 50 and older actually able to get?
I think the barrier probably, or the barrier, the point where things change more is after 65 and older. So, the most common occupations partly are the largest ones because they're not broken, the smaller ones don't pop up, but you have lots of professional ones. But a lot of the common occupations for women, and they're very different for women and men. What's interesting is how little overlap there is between the occupations for women and men. I think it's some retail and supervisors of workers, first line workers, which sounds the same, but really also is in different fields. And so what you can see, there is a split between professional occupations. For women, it's teachers, nurses, for men, it's various managerial ones, and then much more physical ones, retail, childcare, care work. Care work, of course, has grown a lot. Healthcare work has grown a lot, and healthcare work has a broad range of jobs, from very good ones to very poor ones. And when you, what is interesting about this, when you look at the chart for men who are older than 65 compared to women who are older than 65, for women, a lot of the better paid occupations have disappeared. So the common ones are typically paid less than $12 or $13. There are some occupations like that for men, but there's a much higher share in there of the kind of lawyers, professional workers. This is 65 and 9. Chief executives, post-secondary teachers. You can see there are many fewer that pay less than $12 or $13. So
right.
it splits out, and you have the care workers. You have women working in nursing homes, women working in people's home doing care work. There are more men coming into this, particularly men of color, and it's a kind of, some of it is heavy lifting work, but it is a low wage occupation, which people may want to do also for company and for doing good work, but often they definitely have to do it, and it can be physically strenuous work. This breakdown of what occupation, particularly women, work in, I would imagine is going to change more and more, so become maybe a little bit more like men, maybe not as well paid, but to move into the same occupation, because these 65 to 95-year-olds are really mostly pre-baby boomers. So the big expansion in women's access to better jobs and higher levels of education is really coming into retirement now, if you like.
Okay. So now in your education, or in your book, this is from the how education impacts older workers. You break down the job categories by age bracket. So you were able to, so people who are looking at the report can look at men 65 to 69, men 70 to 74, men 75 to 79, and looking that way, you can see, some of the jobs that last throughout, but some of those physical jobs, like you were saying, they might have been prevalent in 60 to 64, a little bit less the next bracket, and so forth.
What I just saw a report that the AARP published, and they did a survey of what they called low-income workers, people whose income is less than 300% of poverty, in their 50s, and asked them about retirement intentions. And I think of those who were working at that stage, close to half said they could never envisage retiring.
Right.
So whether the work is there or not, but and the work you can get if you are low wage or don't have high qualification basically is physically strenuous work in one way or another.
Right. Now your institute also does a lot of work on the wage gap, which we haven't addressed that directly, but I know that's something that you're tracking on an annual basis. And your most recent analysis talks about the gap between the average pay for men and the average pay for women has been steady for the last several years. So talk to me a little bit more about how that number has changed over time, and you also develop projections for what's going to happen to it going forward. So talk to me about that a bit.
Yeah, it is linked to education also. So here you can see our projection of when the wage gap may close, if it changes at the same rate as it has since the 1960s. And really, things haven't changed a lot in the last decade or so, even though women have overtaken men at all levels of education. And, the gap between being in and out of the workforce because of childcare and so on is falling all the time. So you can see on those projections since the 1960s, for all women and men, it will take until 2059 for it to close. If you would start, say, from 2000, just the most recent decade, it will take even longer.
Because it's been flattening since then.
Because it has been flattening. And, this all women and all men, the median earning for women of color, for Black women or Hispanic women, are substantially lower than those of white women, which is partly due to education. But again, if you only compare Black women with a bachelor's degree to white women and white men with bachelor's degrees, the gap is even bigger than the normal back. So education obviously lifts earnings, but it does not eliminate the wage gaps.
Right. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the 2059 or the 2059 number. That's just a straight line projection. Yeah. It's like if we're gonna take all the data points and project it out on a straight line, that's where it would end up. You also do that for each state in the country, right? I mean, so if you drill into the Institute's report on this, you can actually see what you say as you based on the current numbers, what the wage gap in Texas, when the wage gap in Texas on the straight line projection would disappear, and what the wage gap in Wyoming would. Any interesting facts about which states are closer to having it disappear on these projections than others?
I think Florida is one of the ones that would see it close soonest.
Right.
And Wyoming used to be the one that would see its way into the next century. And what's interesting about this is partly it's about gender segregation again. Basically in Florida, a lot of people have very bad jobs, men too. So, being you want a low wage gap in good jobs. You don't want a low wage gap because everybody is in bad jobs.
Right.
And in Wyoming, it has changed a bit now. There were lots of opportunities through fracking and mining, which women were not getting.
Right.
And hence they had a huge wage gap, but they also had reasonably slightly higher average earnings for women in there.
Okay, so I want to bring it back to education a little bit. In your report, this was in the chart book on women's progress, you said that each generation of women has been more likely than the previous generation to enter the labor market with at least a bachelor's degree. And the latest figures show that women are earning a majority of associates, bachelor's, and master's and doctoral degrees. So women have a majority of all four classes. So what do you suspect that will mean going forward? Will that kind of bend that long-range projection?
Women have had more bachelor degrees since the 80s, right? And the problem really is that I mentioned before. If you work in a typically female occupation, and occupational segregation has the likelihood that occupations become more gender integrated has slowed down at the same time as the progress with closing the gender wage gap has closed. So really, unless we tackle that segregation of occupation, the fact that the work that women do in social services, in education, in care work, typically is paid at a lower rate than the work that men do, I don't think we will see a lot of progress.
I mean, when you talk about education or occupational segregation, I mean, talk to me a little bit more about that. Is that because of barriers to women entering fields, or is that because of choices women are making as to what kind of fields they choose to enter? I mean, talk to me about who is doing the segregating.
I'm an economist, and for us, choice is never the question, but constraints on choice. So the first, yes, it's choice, but women don't learn often about the opportunities that out there. We do a lot of work on construction. Okay, construction is very hard work, right? But you can, if you get into a registered apprenticeship scheme or you're in the union sector, you can make a very good living without needing a degree. Women don't see anybody on sites. You go past it, they think of manufacturing as dirty and not welcoming. So, you kind of don't, your counselors, your career counselors don't tell you to go there. That's the first issue. That there are no role models, and therefore you can't envision yourself that way. The second thing is that there are real barriers through discrimination. We've heard a lot about Me Too and Time's Up, and those there's issues of working in a hostile environment where you may be the one woman, and even if you don't get harassed outright, it's just not you. And that's particularly so for women of color. It holds women off. So that is another issue. And then, of course, work-family. We don't have work-family supports. It still is the fact that women take out more time to look after kids. And also in old age, they are more likely to do the time-consuming caregiving supports of their parents or a spouse. So the caregiving work is still very imbalanced, and in the US we get very few public supports for doing that work.
Okay, so we've been talking about the wage gap, but I don't think we actually mentioned what the figure is right now. Is it 81%, right?
So basically the headline figure is for people who work full-time year-round. The people who are more committed, and there we can go back to the 1960s. And there, women earn 80.5 cents for each dollar earned by a man. Okay.
I'm sorry,
80.5.
80.5.
So 80 and a half cents.
Okay. And within that, so that's all full-time workers, all occupations. Mm-hmm. Once you drill into, a particular occupation with people who have, the same educational status, I mean, what are the bright spots? Or are there bright spots where things are equal?
So, there are some, often in the fields where women are underrepresented. So in the tech field or construction managers or, those type of jobs, engineering, there are few women, but the wage gap is not as pronounced. And that may be just because you have to be so dedicated to make it in there. So really, it's men in nursing tend to go to the top. Women in engineering don't go to the top, but they rise, and those who persist are very good. So actually, they probably should be making more, in fact. Right. But at least the differences aren't as big. The kind of worst sectors are those that involve money. So financial advisors, Wall Street, retail sales, anything with commissions. Men sell cars, women sell kind of T-shirts or cosmetics. So all those type of jobs have a big wage gap.
Okay. Now I just want to share kind of summing up some of what you were saying right there. This is from your Chartbook report. You say that in 1960, just 1/3 of workers were women. 50 years later, almost every other worker is female. The workforce today is much more diverse than in the past by gender, age, race, and ethnicity, and all trends are projected to continue. But, you note, the glass ceiling is alive and well. Women are 43% of workers in managerial, business, and financial positions, 27% of CEOs, and fewer than 5% of Fortune 1000 CEOs. So it's, the big picture trends are moving in the right direction, but I mean, I guess particularly at the highest levels, that's where the biggest gaps often are.
At the highest level, so as we've kind of stalled, and we don't quite know why. What is the big barrier? Right. Women. I mean, there has been a lot of progress during the last 20, 30 years. Women do work in all kinds of fields. I mean, there are no fields left where there are no women. They are at all kinds of level of responsibility. but there isn't equality. And really at the top, there has been very little movement. In Congress, movement is slow, much slower than in other countries. And we can't kind of seem to break into this occupational segregation. Women do women's jobs, men do men's jobs, which means that also the rewards are lower there. And all of these issues, white women have made more progress on the whole than black women. And this is particularly in the black community. Women always have had higher labor force participation rates, have done a lot to support their families, and the last recession has really hit quite a lot of those communities badly, and they're finding it difficult to come back in. So they're also, as the population is becoming more diverse, hopefully things are going to get more integrated. Hopefully the Me Too and the Time's Up movements are going to make a difference. But, we have to see.
Right.
Hope and see, or do and see.
Right. And so finally, I just want to kind of tie this back into the decision that we started with, the question we started with, why are people working longer? And I want to touch on how the wage gap and these other things we've been talking about, the educational status and so forth, plays on the decision to retire and the assets that people have if they want to retire. I mean, you do research on how the assets that people have in their 60s when they're trying to make the retirement decision, and what does that show you in the differences between men and women?
Well, as you would expect, men have more wealth, they have more assets, and they have more earnings from employment, and that continues to hold. What's really interesting is how important Social Security is to keep the people afloat. If you look both at how much people get from Social Security and how many people have that as the main form of their income. So Social Security, again, if you've been married for 10 years, then you will get part of your husband's Social Security. If you haven't been married, then that isn't open to you. Again, with Social Security, there are all these issues. Can you last until you're 70, before you take it, because your returns will be much higher, which a lot of low-wage women and men cannot. And really, if you think about our retirement assets apart from work, a lot of it is housing. And housing wealth is deeply segregated by race and ethnicity. So if you look in all the large population groups, men have more assets, more earnings, more Social Security income. But those differences, basically nobody has very much on average in the black population or the Hispanic population. So women are disadvantaged or have to rely on their spouses, but also across communities there are really big differences, which means probably people will have to keep working.
Okay. And with that, I think we need to draw to a close. I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from Ariane Hegewisch of the Institute for Women's Policy Research about the links between education and people's work lives into the 70s and 80s. Find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.